Hello. So thank you for coming out tonight to our presentation. Tonight's entertainment will include a presentation on backyard stewardship. A little more background on myself. As Susie mentioned, I'm the stewardship coordinator at RVC. So that entails monitoring a lot of the conservation easements that we have, as well as our preserves located in Northwest New Jersey, specifically in the Blairstown area. I also spend my time doing ecological gardening for private and for public spaces, in which I encourage native plant design and implementation in those areas, which we will touch upon in this presentation. And also, as a disclaimer, I'm sorry if there's any dog barking. That's just, there's 2 dogs in my house and there's often something outside that they like to bark at, so I apologize in advance. Okay, so becoming a backyard steward, how landowners fit into the conservation puzzle. So a little overview is we're going to go over the steps to becoming a steward of your own backyard. We're going to start off with a little bit of background of the area, a little bit of land history, just how the land in Northwest Jersey got to be that way. Because it's important to understand the history of the area in order to better plan for the future of it. We're also going to go over what is there and what is missing, specifically in your yard, going over the good, the bad, and the ugly that pops up and how to combat them. We're also going to go into what you would want that to be, a native landscape, and how to get there, and understanding where you fit into the bigger picture of Northwest Jersey, and as well as New Jersey itself and the East Coast, and so on and so forth. So a little background. So what shaped the land was a series of geological events that included glacial movement and series of ice ages and everything that the whole world went through. But specifically Northwest Jersey and the Kittatinny Range was shaped by a lot of glacial movement. And that's why we see these characteristic geography that we have, or geology that we have in these karst topography, which is limestone rock, that is these limestone outcrops that shape the land and form these ridges and valleys that we know in this area today. The first real stewards of the land were the Native Americans, specifically the Lenape tribe, who are still here today and very present in the community up in Northwest Jersey, who we work with closely on a bunch of different projects. But unfortunately, as time went on, first settlers slowly eradicated a lot of the different tribes and moved them into different areas. But while they were here, they utilized land for the different resources, like those geological formations as shelter and cover, and using the different resources like the trees, the deer, the water for fishing. And they were nomadic tribes on their way to Southeast New York for more fertile lands. As the first settlers came in, they started to establish much more different type of living. They established churches in different communities and villages. That's some that we still see today in the old stone buildings, but that continued to shape the land and how it was utilized, more specifically the agricultural use, which we still see today. Sussex and Warren County are the top two counties in agricultural use for New Jersey and producers. And agricultural is one of the biggest influences on the environment around them for the different types of actions that they use to go through their farming processes, whether it be organic or not, or utilizing permaculture, different practices. They all shape the land in different ways. And that fast forwards to today, we see a lot of this type of industry still present, as well as much more development that has gone on, which is something we've seen all throughout New Jersey and all over the world. In fact, the continuing urbanization is very prevalent in this area as well. So to start doing the stewardship in your backyard, I'd like to suggest just taking a look outside your window. That's something you can do. You wake up in the morning, you have your cup of coffee or whatever your drink of choice is, and just take a look out your window. And what do you see? So whether you know it or not, you can just jot down what you see, whether it's a picture or, journaling, however you want to record it. Take inventory of your yard. Is it something that you planted there? Something you might have, just walked into Lowe's or Home Depot and saw a plant that you liked and wanted to place it there to spruce up the yard a bit. Was it already there when you bought the house? Is it something that you would like to have there is another factor in this, as well as does it belong there, which is something we're going to get further into in this presentation, as far as delineating between invasive, native, and non-native, and what should be there. Once you have an inventory of your yard, you should do some research on the different things that are there, whether they're beneficial, whether it's beneficial to yourself or to the flora and fauna that surround them. And as you move on from there, you need to make a plan and make a cause of action to continue making things in your yard work better, whether it's starting with, just from your steps or moving forward. So as you look out your window, you then want to look a little bit further. And so moving on from your sidewalk into possibly what we see in a lot of American yards is the lawn. Now the lawn has its benefits. It's nice and green and it's very nice to, take care of and look at, and somewhat easier than a garden for many people. However, there are a lot of detrimental effects of the garden. In the grass. Having a green lawn often takes a lot of fertilization, which the use of chemicals can leach into the groundwater depending on what type of well system you have or septic, but that can also leach into nearby water bodies. The lack of having plants in the yard reduces the stormwater runoff retention in your yard, and often will run off into local streams and wetlands, which will then change the chemistry of those streams and can affect not only the water temperatures and such, that affects the different life that lives within them. In addition to that, the killing off the weeds in your yard can have different effects on the animals that rely on it. Right now, we see a lot of dandelions popping up in the yard, which to many people is an eyesore, but to a lot of bumblebees, this is their first stop in the springtime for a meal. So by cutting it down and removing them, you're getting rid of a lot of their food source. Similar to that is different types of yard techniques, such as misuse of water, in a sprinkler system. A typical grassland you see will be green for the majority of the summer, depending on the cool or warm season grasses that are growing, and then will then turn yellow in the fall and senesce and stay that way throughout the winter and the early spring. And to many, that is an eyesore, but that is how it naturally occurs, and that's because it is going with the natural flow of water and the seasonal changes. So keeping an eye on the conservation of water, which is a whole nother issue that we can go into and whatnot, but we'll breeze by that. But being conscious of your water use, as well as the different things that you're putting into your yard, such as dyed mulch. You can use an alternative like wood chips, which you can often get for free from arborists in your area if you contact them, because they're usually just trying to get rid of it and it costs them money to get rid of it. So they would love to drop it off to any place they can. Moving on from there, you might see your woodlands or wetlands. So I understand not everybody has, 100 acres where they have a lot of woods to move into, especially in New Jersey. But whether you have, a half an acre or 100 acres, there's usually some section of your yard that resembles somewhat of a woodlands or a wetlands, whether it be a puddle or a large pond. However, those both areas are areas of focus in, especially in Northwest New Jersey, that we are trying to conserve, but also come with a lot of different issues involving invasive species, both plant and animal. And we will go over the invasive species next, as well as the different pests that affect the different woodlands and wetlands. So the usual suspects, I'll start with a few of the more popular ones. There's a lot of different invasives that you can harp on all day long. You can even look up a list online of the invasive species that are in your area. And if you do look at it, you may want to crawl under a bed and never go outside again. But the ones on the following slides are the ones that you really got to look out for, and the ones that are at least manageable at this point in time and easy to identify. So right now we are seeing garlic mustard in flower, and this plant is a biannual. It is distinguished by its pungent odor of, a mix of garlic and mustard. So it'll send up one singular basal rosette in its first year, and then the second year we see this flowering taller stalk in the woods. The unfortunate factor of this plant is that it has a very prolific seed bank. So often you are managing it for a long time, but the best way to approach it is just by pulling it in its second year. It's very hard to pull in its first year, but in its second year, it's very easy to identify, especially after a rain such as tonight. The soil's a little bit looser. It's much easier to just go out and pull it. And then you can follow up with mulching in that area, usually a heavy mulching or putting down cardboard and a slightly less level mulch. You're able to suppress some of the seed bank. Don't be surprised if things come back because of how mustards in general, how they set seed is when you walk by them, they jump out and they spread every which way but loose. And that's one of the reasons why they are taking over in a lot of our areas. But luckily, pulling is very easy solution to that. The next one we have is autumn olive. This is a very popular hedgerow plant that you see along the edges of farm fields. It was planted for its silvery underside that we see on the bottom picture, and its fruit that we have on the top, which is edible. It forms these long hedgerows that we see that can make a long border across different farm fields. However, it does cause lots of different monocultures in areas and unable to have native shrubs come into those areas. The best way to tackle autumn olive is through a cut stump treatment. This involves cutting the tree down or the shrub and using an herbicide and a very accurate precision application to the stump only. This way you're not fully broadcasting over the entire plant because they can get over 10 to 12 feet high. So it's easier to cut it down and then treat it that way. You can also avoid the use of herbicide by doing a constant mowing. We have an autumn olive problem in a lot of our different preserves, and currently we have a forestry mowing practice that we do at some of them, in which we just have them consistently mowed, and which some of them we come back to treat at volunteer events. The next is multiflora rose. This is one that came up in the agricultural sector as a use to block in livestock from different farm fields to deter them from moving from one field to another or to different crops. Because if anybody's ever walked through multiflora rose, it is very much a deterrent to walk through. It is not a very pleasant plant to encounter. It's identified for its different thorns that are barbed and they go in the other direction. So rather than just a straight type of needle-like motion like the Japanese barberry, this one kind of hooks and grabs. And it deters from the native rose because it is, as the name suggests, has multiple flowers in a cluster per shrub, rather than the singular cluster of flowers in the native rose, which is the Carolina or the pasture rose, which are beautiful plants, and I encourage to plant those types of roses in your yard. But multiflora can be treated through a similar method as autumn olive. So going through and mowing it cuts it down a lot, because at times this can tower over you and form these walls of roses that are very hard to penetrate through. So cutting them down first is a good step. This way you can tackle them better. They're more at an ankle to knee height. Cutting them in the spring especially, so that allows them to grow a little bit higher up and you can identify them in the summertime. Now these can be dug out and removed that way. It is a lot of work, but if you have a small patch of multiflora rose, I encourage doing that and following up with a planting soon after. Typically, it is very hard to remove the entire root system. I encourage using a pitchfork, which is digging right into the ground and being able to lift the roots right up, rather than using a shovel that can just chop the roots up and you'll still have sprouts coming from those roots. It's a very hardy plant and kind of difficult to get rid of, but if you have a lot of determination, you can kind of tackle it. Another method is after you're mowing, is it spraying of a foliar herbicide. The benefit to mowing it first is now that the herbicide is spraying much lower and at a less amount. So if you have any concerns with herbicide, that can be put at a minimum by mowing it first. But with any of the herbicide that is talked about in this presentation, please consult a professional first about any types that you're going to be using, or any types of methods that you're considering, or even if you have a larger problem, you may have to hire someone to do that. So Japanese barberry is a hugely popular invasive ornamental. As we see on the top, it came in through the landscape trade for its red foliage. It's an attractive bush that people like to have in their yard as kind of like a statement, but it is spread prolifically throughout the woods of New Jersey and have absolutely wreak havoc in forming monocultures in the understory of the woods. It is relatively unpalatable to any type of animal because of its thorns. Its berries are edible besides the seeds, but only the birds really snack on them, and that's one of the reasons why they also spread, is through the eating of the berries. Barberry is best controlled in a similar way as multiflora rose, so cutting it down and either digging it up or the use of herbicide. It is one of the easiest ones to kill via herbicide. It actually dies right away. It's actually quite a wimp, even though it's has these robust thorns. Will die fairly quickly. But like Susie had mentioned in the beginning of the slideshow, of how if your neighbor has barberry, then you will also have barberry, and this is very true. It's a plant that will take off anywhere, either in wetlands and in dry areas. So it is something to keep an eye on in your yard. Japanese silkgrass is a ground cover that came in on the shipping trade. It was used in different crates as a way to fill before packing peanuts were invented. Unfortunately, when they were added to the shipping containers, they were in seed. Grass seed is very known to be very prolific. So when you catch this plant at the wrong time, it spreads very similarly to how the garlic mustard spreads, where when you walk by it, it shoots out hundreds of seeds. Luckily for us, Japanese silkgrass is an annual, which makes it very easy to control. A popular method is timed mowing, which you can do mowing the grass before it sets seed, which is typically before Labor Day. Depends on the weather that year. You usually have to keep an eye on it. But usually towards the end of August, keep an eye on the stiltgrass if it's going to seed or not. But the best way to follow up with that is to cover it with a thick layer of wood chips and supplement with native plantings. The wood chips will then suppress the seed source. Since it is an annual, it won't come back if you mow it, because it will then die off and not come back. But like with most plants, it has a seed bank and is ready to go almost at any given time if the conditions are right. Japanese honeysuckle is the next one. For many people, you may have very fond childhood memories of the summertime and the sweet smell of honeysuckle, and even the nectar that comes from the flowers. I mean, I'm guilty of it. It comes out in June, or even around now, I've seen the flowers come out. Very pretty flower. However, it wreaks havoc in our forest understories and overstories. As we see in the bottom picture, it can just sprawl out and spread out its vines all over different types of shrubs. So the concern in many people's yards is that it will climb up a lot of your shrubs and choke them out, because it'll outcompete for the resources in that area for the shrubs that you have desired or planted there. And since its flowers are so prominent, it is very easy for it to spread vegetatively as well. The best way to control this is a similar way to how English ivy can be controlled, is by creating what's called a survival ring around the tree or shrub that you wish to free up. That entails pulling the honeysuckle manually from the plant within like a 5-foot diameter of the shrub, and balling it up kind of like twine almost, just because it is a vine and you can wrap it up within itself. You can then place it either high in a tree or somewhere off the ground, or even in your driveway to dry out. This way there is no root contact with any dirt, so that it cannot set root anymore. And we'll go over disposal techniques at the end of this section, but that is one of the best ways to do it. It is very, you can spray herbicide to it, but it is a very difficult plant to control with herbicide because of its waxy type of cuticle on the leaves. It makes it very hard for the herbicide to penetrate within it, as well as the way that it spreads rhizominously. It'll just keep going, and you don't know where the end of the plant is, and you may not get the entire plant when you spray. They do have another invasive counterpart of the bush honeysuckle that is also found in our woods. However, there is a native replacement for honeysuckle, for this Japanese honeysuckle, in coral honeysuckle, which is an orange flower, and it grows in a similar habitat. So I encourage replacing one honeysuckle with the other. The next is wineberry. This is a popular plant in a lot of our woods, not only for the birds eating it, but a lot of humans do enjoy the berries that come from the wineberry bushes. They are a very sweet tasting berry that comes in the summertime. However, they do form monocultures similar to the other invasive shrubs. But luckily, these ones are also very easy to remove. I find that they are easy to pull when you can get a hand on them. They are thorny, so please take caution if you do wish to pull them, but they can also be dug out as well. For that plant, and you can also do a cultural control of this by taking the berries from it before the birds get to them, if you're lucky enough, or getting into them before they drop on the ground and spread more, and using them in any sort of type of jam or jelly, or you can even make different types of drinks with them and just eat them plain. Just be careful of where the seeds are being discarded of. Another invasive vine is the mile-a-minute. Also came in on the landscape trade for its aesthetically pleasing blue berries that grow along the vine. This plant, as the name suggests, grows very fast and can take over in similar areas as where Japanese stiltgrass comes in. So often if you remove one of these invasive species and don't follow up with either native plantings or wood chippings, mile-a-minute is one of the first ones to come in. When that happens, it's fighting fire with fire a little bit with removing one invasive to another. It's just an endless process sometimes. But mile-a-minute can be pulled as well as controlled with a pre-emergent. A pre-emergent can be sprayed in certain areas, and that can control mile-a-minute as well as Japanese stiltgrass. It is an expensive undertaking as far as herbicide application for it, but it does work very well in different wetland settings as well as grasslands. Another popular one in these two popular ones are the ornamental series. So this is something that you probably will see either out your front door or in your neighbor's yard, Chinese silvergrass or miscanthus. As you can see in the picture to the left, the seed heads are very large, and that allows for them to spread very easily, and they are very hard to dig up. But luckily, when you cut it back and you do a constant mowing, like with any grass, it can die off very quickly. Burning bush came in again through the ornamental trade for its red foliage. This one is another difficult one to remove, but can be done with a similar method as autumn olive with the cut stump treatment. You can dig it up, but it often comes from such a large root system that you may not get all of it. So if you want even red foliage in your yard, there are plenty of plants that we'll go over in a couple of slides that can supplement that type of aesthetic in your yard. Tree of Heaven is one that we see commonly in a lot of waste areas or just on the side of the road, as you see in the bottom left-hand picture. Even if you drive along 78, this is one of the trees, one of the few trees that you see growing along the highway is Tree of Heaven. Recently, it's become an even bigger concern for a lot of people because of its feeding of the spotted lanternfly, which we'll go into in a little bit, which is an invasive pest that has come from Asia. It is known also for its very pungent odor. Some people say it smells like peanut butter. Some people say it smells like garbage. So either way, it can be identified through its large buds that they have in the wintertime and scaly bark, and its very pungent odor. The way to control this is through either a cut stump method or what's called hack and squirt, which is where you chop part of the bark and inject a herbicide to it. Because cutting this tree down does cause it to grow even more. So I discourage the use of just mowing constantly because it will not work. If anything, when you cut it, it comes back a lot stronger. So if you do cut the tree down, be sure to follow it up with an herbicide treatment. Bittersweet is the next vine that we have in our woods. As we see in the picture to the right, it climbs trees and chokes them out. It often will come part of the tree and just keep twirling and twirling until it eventually climbs to the top and chokes it out, whether it's just by outcompeting it for light or by breaking branches and causing death to the top of the tree. It's become a problem because of its berries that we see in the left-hand picture. It's one of the few food sources that are available for a lot of different birds in the wintertime. Unfortunately, the only types of birds that it feeds are a lot of generalist species that will really eat anything anyway. So they feed on them, and often you see bittersweet seedlings underneath evergreen trees where the birds are sitting in the wintertime to warm up and take cover. The way to control this is through pulling. If you're determined enough to get some of the larger ones, you can cut and pull. Some of the smaller ones are very easy to pull, luckily, but you can also handle that with cutting the vines and applying the herbicide directly to the stump of the vine. Moving into some of the pests that we see in our woods is the emerald ash borer. This has moved, I've noticed, into North Jersey more so this year. We've had it in Central Jersey for quite a few years now, almost 10. The first was discovered in Duke Farms in Hillsborough. Emerald ash borer came here from Europe and Asia, and it came into here through just plant trades. What it does is it bores into the bark of the tree, and as you see on the bottom left-hand picture, it creates this different type of pattern which cuts off the resources for the tree and will cause die-off eventually. So unfortunately, you may have it for a while and you won't see it for a couple years until it turns into the picture that we see on the right, which is the ash tree tanning, it is known as. That's when we see the tree is completely decayed. It starts with the picture in the middle there with the lichen. After at that point, your tree only has about 2 or 3 years left on it until it is most likely to fall. Unfortunately, with ash trees, when you do cut them down, they do cause quite a bit of a mess if you have one in your yard. Because of how the borer works, it goes into the tree and takes a lot from the inside. It will shatter when it falls. That's why a lot of people have cut them down earlier in order to use their firewood when it's still viable before it decays completely in the inside. One of the ways to combat this, there's no way to stop emerald ash borer. Unfortunately, the problem has gone too far for too long. So the only thing you can do really with it is it depends on your yard. So if you would like to keep a wildlife stag, you can keep the ash tree standing. It will stand for a fair amount of time. And if you don't mind it falling in your woods, that is actually beneficial for trees to fall. They become a different source for more trees to grow onto, as other vegetation will take a hold of it once it falls, as well as different wildlife using it as a cavities, and woodpeckers, squirrels use it for different types of habitat. And when you can get it early enough, you can utilize it for firewood purposes, whether that's in a stewardship plan of utilizing firewood for sale or just for your own home. Next is a spotted lanternfly. It's a problem that I think will be hitting North Jersey probably by storm this summer. It has been found in Pennsylvania a few years ago and came into Central Jersey and parts of South Jersey last year very prolifically, in the sense in the picture you see in the top right-hand corner where they just cover the trees. So when they came in here, they started to feed on the invasive tree that I mentioned earlier, the tree of heaven, which is fine. If they kill off that tree, that would, make my life a whole lot easier. But unfortunately, they have started to eat a lot of our native trees like black walnut, different maples. They've even been seen on oaks, which can be very harmful to the timber industry as far as utilizing that types of wood that the ash tree was once supplying to, as well as just, we have declining trees in our forests. In general, we do not have much regeneration happening because of the invasive threats, as well as the overpopulation of deer. So losing our woods due to the spotted lanternfly would be extremely detrimental, because the problem with them is when they feed, they secrete this sugary substance known as honeydew, and this honeydew then encourages the growth of black sooty mold, which will then lead to the death of the tree. So it's not necessarily that the spotted lanternfly is eating the tree itself, it's just the things that are caused afterwards from them taking a little bit from the tree's resources will then have these consequences down the line. So if you're lucky enough so you are able to squish them, that is one of the best methods you can do with the spotted lanternfly, is to just kill them off. Unfortunately, in types of situations that you see on the right with an infestation, you need to just call a professional and they will treat it. If you see it, you should report it. There's different avenues that you can go through that, but typically you go through the DEP. They have a hotline now that you can call when you do see them. They can come out to your area and they will control it for free. Another method is, if it's a smaller group, you can use a bottle and you place the bottle over where the direction of which they may be going into, and they will jump right into the bottle because they are very fast and they can jump very far. So the bottle method, I learned about it actually from my neighbors who are 5 and 7. So if they can do it, I'm sure you guys are plenty able to do that. And a lot of times you can make it a competition if you have young ones or grandkids or anything. It is a fun little trick to just go catch spotted lanternflies, and you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone in that sense of getting rid of them and saving the tree that they are on. But the big thing is to report them so that they are monitored in this area, since it is relatively new, but also can cause a lot of harm, since they have been known to feed on different vines, such as grapevines, which is extremely detrimental to the wine industry. And a shortage of that wouldn't make very many people happy. So a huge problem that we have in New Jersey in general, and especially just the East Coast, is the overpopulation of white-tailed deer. In the picture here, we see a woods that on the left, which is a healthy understory, which is what we should be seeing in a lot of our woods, but all too often we see the picture on the right, in which there is nothing below 5 feet. We either see that in our woods, or we see typically a monoculture of barberry or multiflora or stilt grass. So where they come into the woods is that they eat anything native that they can get their hands on or hooves on, anything 5 feet and below. So the only really way to deal with this issue is through different hunting programs. Whether you're a hunter yourself or you know a hunter, I encourage to allow hunting on your land to help manage the deer population in your area. Studies have shown that typically the normal amount of deer per square mile is 10 for it to be a healthy forest. And once you see 20 deer per square mile, that's when you start to see a threat to different types of regeneration on the forest, is a lot of increased herbivory. So with those numbers in mind, here in Somerset and Hunterdon County in central Jersey, we have over 200 deer per square mile, and I'm pretty sure the numbers are steadily increasing. So that is obviously tenfold past the point of repair. So the biggest thing I can encourage is to either enclose your area or encourage for hunting in those different areas. We have a program at one of our preserves at Muckshot Ponds Preserve where we have 10 hunters this year that hunt our preserves in order to keep the numbers down on that specific area. There are different guidelines that they follow, and luckily one of them is allowing our hunters, when they do harvest their deer, one of them has to be donated to a local area, whether it's the Lakota Wolf Preserve. They use them to feed the wolves there. And the other one we use is for Hunters Helping the Hungry, which is allowing the meat to go donated to people who need it more than the hunters may have too much. So luckily there is a donation involved with hunting. So even if you don't eat meat, there is an option for having the meat go to somewhere it will be of great use. So we went over some of the techniques involved in controlling a lot of these different issues. So they basically get breaking down into mechanical, chemical, biological, and cultural techniques for each one. The picture in the top left corner is one that I talked about earlier about with English ivy that you can do with a lot of our vines like Japanese honeysuckle or Oriental bittersweet, in which you create where you can just kind of roll them up like a burrito and cut them from the ground and reroot them that way and remove them from any tree that they may be suppressing the growth of. So that's one of the mechanical techniques that you can use for invasive plant control, as well as the digging out and grubbing out, cutting with either with just pruners or a handsaw, as well as just going in with a brush cutter or even as large as a forestry mower. Chemical is one of the other ones, which is a popular one used in either larger scale projects or even on the small scale use. I do understand that that is often not the preferred method, especially in your own yard. There are organic options for chemical use. That there's the brand Bonide typically comes out with. I use Burnout, which is the combination of citric acid and clove oil. So it has actually a very nice smell when you spray it, but it uses the method of these very potent types of vegetable-based chemicals to burn out the top of the plant, which makes controlling it a lot easier. So it's not necessarily I'm saying to go out and spray Roundup, that I do not encourage that at all, but knowing that different types of chemicals that are involved can greatly help you in how to control some of them, because there's certain plants such as Japanese knotweed that can only really be controlled through herbicide, unfortunately. So knowing how to tackle the problem and even just consulting a professional And if you have any questions regarding them, you can contact me with any questions, and I can consult you on what chemicals to use or point you to a professional that would be able to help you with your issue. Because if you do have a large infestation of different invasive species, I understand it's really hard to tackle just on your own, and you may need help here and there. So biological and cultural controls are some of the ones we talked about as far as eating them, or just using different techniques, is like burning that we see on the bottom left. I'm not saying go out in your yard and go scorched earth policy on that, but even though that is sometimes nice to have a clean slate, I don't encourage that. Your neighbors may start to look. But prescribed burns is a very popular way to control a lot of different invasives. South Jersey uses them a lot in the Pinelands region. That whole area is known for its fire adapted ecology. So in that area, it makes a lot of sense. And for certain plants, you can, once you dig them up, you can just burn them. I have a neighbor who does that with their multiflora rose. Once they dry it out, they just have it burned in a fire, which is a very effective way to get rid of the plant if you're worried about it reseeding. But most importantly, being sure to, if you have any questions, just to consult a professional on the subject matter, so that if it's something that you seem too big to tackle at one time, or if you're unsure how to go about it, make sure you do some research and contact somebody who may know more. So next I will go into the power plants. This is the fun part of the presentation. At least I can talk about plants all day long. So once you've removed the invasives from your yard, you want to replace them with something, because often the problem with invasive plants is that the natives haven't been able to outcompete them. So supplying them with, just kind of giving them a bump start, starting that native plant community via different plantings can really help outcompete the invasives on your property. So you don't necessarily have to go through it and even remove every single speck of an invasive species in your yard, as long as you follow up with a heavy planting. And you can even just do it in sections, because that is the best way to approach it. But some of the ones I have here are ones that can either take up a lot of space, or they spread very prolifically. Specifically, mountain mint is one of my favorite plants to use. It grows pretty well in a lot of different conditions. It is a pollinator favorite. Lots of different types of bees and insects and wasps all love to feed on mountain mint. It may seem like a dull flower at the top, but luckily the deer, because of its minty taste, the deer leave it completely alone. So it's one of the few plants that you could plant in your yard and not have to worry about something eating it. And it will spread very readily. Another pollinator favorite is the golden Alexander, as we see in the top right-hand corner. That has been known for a lot of different pollinators to take hold of them, as well as it's a spring bloomer. So it's something will pop up early in the spring, kind of get your garden kick-started, as well as adding like a little pop of color, and the foliage stays around for the rest of the summer. One of the trees that I highly recommend is the white oak. It is, for those who are familiar with the Doug Tallamy books, that one has been found to be the top species to plant in your yard because of its number of species that it supports. It supports over 500 different species. It has a high number of caterpillars or Lepidoptera species that grow or that feed off of it, which in turn a lot of the birds eat. So it is a very vital resource for a lot of different animals. As well as blue vervain that we see on the right. That plant a lot of times will come in older farm fields, and luckily it is another one that is a very prolific spreader. So when it does come in, it has this great sea of blue that will pop in the fields that the bumblebees absolutely love. Few others that are easier to grow and add a little different height to your gardens. Bee balm is a very easily propagated plant and will spread very readily because of it's also known as wild bergamot. So because of its different smell and it's when the leaves are rubbed and even the flowers, it's unpalatable to deer and rabbits. So they leave that alone. And as the name suggests, the bees love it. Pasture thistle is another one that is a pollinator favorite. The thing that you have to watch out with most thistles is that we do have two different types of invasive thistles that grow in our area, the Canadian thistle and the bull thistle. So keeping an eye on what is growing in your yard and seeing if you can just support it with the pasture thistle instead of the invasive ones that do spread very rapidly. And usually they come back in full force whenever you do try to pull them. So it is another plant that you can just try to outcompete it with the native version. Doll's eyes that we see on the left adds a nice interest to the garden in the summertime when the seed heads pop up. The foliage is just a regular green, but the berries that we see here pop up in the summertime at a red stem with these white different berries that are poisonous to animals when they eat them. So the deer typically tend to leave them alone. One that I personally like to use on the right-hand side is the button bush. It's a really popular plant that you can use for rain gardens. It can grow in a variety of conditions, but does really well in moist soils. So if you have a wet area in your yard, I encourage using button bush. It has this really attractive flower that we see here on the right that supports different moths and different bumblebees, as well as it being able to grow into a woody shrub afterwards, which will add a different layer to your garden, as well as herbaceous. And I would like to explain the middle graphic that I have here. This comes from the Prairie Nursery website. They have a document on there, which we have provided in our resource sheet, that lists the different types of native plants and their pollinator associations with them. So you can really see which ones are going to give you the most bang for your buck. Like we see here, wild lupine is supporting all the different types of bumblebees that we see at the top, hummingbirds, butterflies, as well as milkweed, which is another common plant that luckily is really great to have in the garden. Any type of milkweed I encourage planting. A few others we have our New England aster. Any aster is really a great sight to see in the fall because it's one of the few plants that are still blooming. They are also one of the favorites for different monarch butterflies as one of their last food resources moving through after milkweed. Since the fall blooming plants are kind of like the last ditch effort before winter sets for animals to get their different food resources. So asters are very important for that. As well as some of the plants to the right, we have our big blue stem, burr sedge, and side oats grama. These are different types of grasses and sedges, which are able to add a different type of focal to your garden, as well as providing different resources to the different fauna in your area. So with big blue stem in the fall, it turns this really bright red color, which if you're really missing your burning bush, you can just plant more big blue stem in there. And it's a lot easier to manage as well. I encourage having grasses and sedges because a lot of times they stick around throughout the winter. Different types of insects do use them as habitat throughout the winter where they nest in there and will hibernate. So when you are taking care of your garden, we encourage to keep up a lot of your plants throughout the winter time and into the early spring. I know a lot of times once it starts getting warm out in the springtime, you get that itch to get outside and go clean up your garden. But I do like to stress that you should wait a little bit until the weather is consistently warm and the plants that may have had hibernating fauna in them are able to, they're able to vacate, and then you can clean them up for aesthetic purposes. Another woody shrub that I like to plant in the yard is black chokeberry. This also turns a nice red color in the fall with its foliage. Is very supportive of different birds as well as insects. New Jersey tea is a very similar shrub that also does the same types of techniques, and it has also really pretty white flower that bumblebees will swarm to, and they have a very similar flower structure as butterfly bush, which is an invasive and popular ornamental. So this is another great one to swap out for butterfly bush, add in New Jersey tea. Tall bellflower is a pretty blue flower that pops up in the woodlands. That is another pollinator favorite, as well as goldenrod. Goldenrod tends to get a bad rep from a lot of people in the fall for blaming them for allergies and whatnot, but goldenrod is really an amazing plant that does provide the similar types of benefits as asters do. They are another fall blooming plant. So, and even when you pair them in your garden, they go really well together, the blues of different types of asters and the yellows of the goldenrods. And they are known to spread very prolifically. So if you do have a problem area such as stiltgrass in your yard, this is a good plant to plant in there to suppress the stiltgrass growth and encourage more native plant growth. A popular question I get a lot is a native ground cover, because all too often we have in people's yards non-native ground covers such as vinca vine, Japanese pachysandra, and a few others that have really just can spread all over, such as honeysuckle as well that we talked about earlier. Some ones that grow really well, especially in Northwest Jersey, is roundleaf ragwort. Is currently flowering in a lot of our preserves. It has this yellow flower that shoots up in the springtime, like right about now. And the foliage of the green are these tiny little spatula-shaped leaves that will also create a really nice ground cover that the deer leave alone. It grows very well in Northwest Jersey because it does like a lot of the rocky soil. So if you're having a difficult time planting things in rockier soils, this is a plant that will adapt very well. Pennsylvania sedge is another one if you would like to kind of keep that lawn look, and have green in your yard, but don't want to have the detrimental effects of an actual lawn. Pennsylvania sedge is a great replacement for that. And honestly, any sedge is really good for having a ground cover and having that kind of green background in any type of garden, and is very low maintenance. Wild ginger is another one that has a very pretty red flower. It is also flowering right now, but the flower grows really closely to the ground, so sometimes it is difficult to see. Typically the deer stay away from it, but they have been found to kind of munch on it a bit here and there, just because, as most people know who have any type of garden, the deer they aren't very picky these days. So they all often will take a nibble, especially this time of year when they're coming out of winter and first growth is popping out. They'll take a test nibble on most plants. So the springtime is a difficult time to kind of see which plants are going to work in your yard, but typically ginger will also be deer proof. Allegheny pachysandra is another one that you can replace with its non-native counterpart, the Japanese pachysandra, which is we see in a lot of people's yards. People are attracted to it for its very green luster that is very shiny, and the fact that it does take over. People like low maintenance, so the pachysandra there, the Japanese one is one that does take off very well in the yard, but if you have the right soil conditions, typically Allegheny pachysandra likes more acidic soils and well-drained soils, but it can take over in the same effect that a Japanese pachysandra will as well. Next one is field pussy toes. This one is also grows in the rocky outcrop communities. It has this lower growing foliage and this white flower that shoots up. And the plantain leaf sedge is a really nice type of sedge that will form more of clumps. So if you want to create a border, it's another low maintenance type of evergreen throughout your garden. So I understand that's a lot of plants that I kind of threw at you, but I encourage you to just, if you want to just start off your project very small, just start off with a few plants that work really well together. And it's really good to have ones that are blooming all throughout the different seasons. Just because of, the bees aren't just going to only eat in the spring and, call it a day. They like to eat all summer long, just like the rest of us. So the plants seen here are prairie smoke on the top left there. That blooms in the spring, as well as the golden Alexander that I mentioned earlier, and Jacob's ladder. Jacob's ladder spreads very prolifically. It's in the pea family. So when you do put it in your garden, it does tend to take over, but it is a native aggressive. So I encourage planting that. In the summertime, supplementing with mountain mint, like I had mentioned earlier, as well as anise hyssop that we see on the right that the monarch heart is on, and butterfly weed that is in the top picture. Butterfly weed is one of the more beneficial plants that we can have in the garden. It is difficult to propagate at times. I encourage trying to just buy the plant whole and trying it in different locations, because milkweed is very picky. I know I had gotten an email from someone earlier about different milkweeds growing in their yard, and typically what that is just, keep trying, because in my yard, I tried for years to get milkweed, just because once you heard about the benefits of them, you want to have milkweed everywhere. And for a while I would spread the seeds everywhere and, place plants, and wouldn't get it for anywhere where I put it down. And then all of a sudden one year I had a couple pop up, and, I prized those plants for a while, and, now they take off in different sections, because honestly, milkweed does what it wants to do. So you can keep trying, bringing it in. So this way it encourages the seeds to spread in your yard, but it may take a few years for them to really establish, because they're going to take off where they want to take off. And for the fall, the more asters and goldenrods. So we see the special goldenrod on the right there, which has these large clusters that the butterflies absolutely go crazy for, and they're really visually attractive as well when you're driving through different fields full of goldenrod. The blue sage that we see on the bottom as well is a nice type of blue color that you'll see not too often in the fall, besides certain types of like bluebird asters, but is a nice summer type of color that in flower that you'll see later on in the season. So a big takeaway from just having, absorbed everything that we've been talking about during this presentation is doing a bite-sized approach, because it is very daunting to just look into your yard. And once you're equipped with the information that you have, you may start to see more and more problems as you start to look into things, because I know I'm very guilty of that. I can look out my window and I see a patch of honeysuckle, and then, from there, I'm like, oh, wow, there's Oriental bittersweet beyond there. And then, it gets to be overwhelming. What I found the best way to approach it is just taking a bite-sized approach. So focusing in on one section, that's doable. So you pick an area in your yard, whether it's right outside your door or in a patch in your woods, and that's the section you're going to work on. You're going to remove the invasives from that section. You're going to follow up with any type of control and maintenance that is involved with that, as well as following up with native plantings. So a lot of times we see this in yards when, if you want to get rid of grass, which is I've slowly been doing in different sections of my yard, where I just do different gardens, which the approach with that, the benefit with that is, like we see in the picture to the left here, is having a corner garden. So this person may have started with this tiny corner, but as we see here, there's still lawn left in the picture. So what they can do in years to come is to add plants around to bump it up into that sidewalk. Maybe now they have plants that border on the other side as well. So just taking tiny bite-sized approach to things makes things a lot more tangible. It's just like having a bite-sized candy bar. It's much more, palatable to eat a bite-sized candy bar than taking on a whole huge candy bar. You may end up eating 20 different types of bite-sized candy bars, but at least, you know, you're doing it in small sections. You feel a whole lot better doing it that way anyway. So I encourage starting off with these little pocket gardens, and whether you have a garden that's, you know, 100 square feet or 1,000 square feet, you'll start to see results instantly. I've seen in neighborhoods where trees have been cut down and there's just lawn everywhere, and just a simple addition of a garden in that area greatly increases the number of pollinator visits from there. It's like a safe refuge for a lot of them when there's an ecological food desert for them in so many different types of developed areas. It's a nice little safe spot for them. So if you want to learn more about some of this stuff, I encourage you to read some of these books that I listed here. Not limited to any of these, but the ones that have breezed through before, and I'm not a huge reader, but these are books that I have read. So that's saying something. But the books by Doug Tallamy are Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope. He really has spearheaded the backyard stewardship and really bringing a native landscape to your own backyard. He's really popularized it, which has been great. And he makes it very easy to read his books, as well as he puts different guides in the back of them and different plants that are deer resistant, or which is a huge problem that we always have to deal with in our area. So different hints and tips like that, as well as The Garden Revolution, which was written by a landscape architect who is focused in ecology. So he has that background encouraging that type of design, because all too often we see a lot of landscape architects who are just focused on the design aspect rather than the function. So it's important to design with function when you are planning a different garden, such as the ones that we see in the Pollinator Victory Garden. And if you want to learn more about different types of invasive species, I encourage the book Beyond the War on Invasive Species. This has a permaculture approach to restoration. So it uses more of the cultural techniques that we touched upon earlier, and gives an insight on different types of invasive plants that are spreading throughout the nation and throughout the world, and a little background on them. So it does help you understand the importance of getting rid of them and why invasives are bad, because of how they outcompete with our natives, and a lot of our native plants and animals aren't able to adapt quick enough to basically recognize them. So a lot of our plants that are, a lot of our animals that have relied on different types of native shrubs and flowers are slowly dying off because of their decline in their food source. So that's why we see a lot of generalist species that are still able to thrive in these types of situations, but we have a huge decrease in specialist species. Another way is to see them in action. So there's a few places, as if you search online about different educational areas of this type of stewardship or restoration in general. Duke Farms in Hillsborough does have a lot of public trails with a focus on sustainability specifically. Once the estate of the Doris Duke, she was very dedicated to a lot of different nature aspects. But the place has turned into an area of different public trails you can ride your bike or just walk onto, as well as they have different types of food programs set up in farmers markets. But their building is really based off sustainability and the use of green energy and such. So they are a really good information hub as far as they host different seminars, and they do have a wealth of knowledge in the natural resource department. The Watershed Institute as well in Pennington, New Jersey, as we see in the bottom left corner, they have a huge rain garden and in their front building, and they have a bunch of trails that walk through different wetlands that have interpretive signs as well, which is good to see them in action as far as what invasive species are there, how they've gotten rid of them, and what they've replaced them with, and how they try to conserve the natives that are growing there. And this is a bit of a hike. It's at least from North Jersey, but it's only about 2 hours or so. But Mount Cuba Center in Hockessin, Delaware, they are a public garden that is exclusively featuring native plants, which is very rare to find at a public garden. often you see a lot of ornamentals and non-native species, but this place is completely native. And they're deer fenced in so they can grow anything they want. And it's honestly a very nice sight to see as you walk through all the different types of landscapes that are there. They have, pond gardens, woodland gardens, as well as formal gardens, which for a lot of people, it is nice to see native plants in that type of setting, because all too often we see native plants pinned as this type of wild look, which a lot of people do like to see, but some people like to have, especially close to their house, a more formal look, which is attainable. And to see an example of that would be great to see them even going on their website. You can walk through their gardens virtually at Mount Cuba Center. So in the bigger picture here, we'd like to see where you fit in. As we see in the picture to the right, we're smack dab in the middle of this Atlantic kind of flyway, as well as just a conservation vision that the Nature Conservancy has set out to obtain this from the Blue Ridge to the Boreal. So by Northwest New Jersey fitting right in there in the middle, we can try to create these different habitats to try to expand wildlife corridors and ultimately just connect everything all together. We've seen in New Jersey, especially the fragmentation that has happened as a result of industrial and urbanization expansion. That's part of the reason why our numbers of deer are very high, because they only are getting pushed into all these different areas that they weren't once able to roam much further. It's like putting 10 pounds of sugar in a 5-pound sack. We're putting, 100 deer in a very small area where they used to be able to roam a lot further. But by connecting these different areas, like North Jersey is home to one of the most contiguous sets of forests in New Jersey in general. So it's important to keep that going by connecting them through different pockets of people's backyards that connect to the different woods nearby. Part of that is what we talked about earlier, that Susie mentioned, is Bobcat Alley. So the Nature Conservancy set out a few years ago to conserve this section of New Jersey known as the Bobcat Alley, because the bobcat, sorry. All right, well, there's still dog barking going on, but to continue on that, there's the Bobcat Alley was set out to try to preserve the different habitats that the bobcat once roamed in New Jersey. Like how I touched upon fragmentation, a lot of their habitat had been lost in that time period. And due to that fact, bobcats, their numbers were very steadily declining. A lot of their loss of habitat caused them just sudden death in a lot of their different packs that they had, which deterred them for reproduction, as well as just general making dens in any area, because they were so fragmented. Because of the graphic that we see on the right, as you move through time, it slowly becomes more and more urbanized. So what the Bobcat Alley aimed to do is to connect these different sections and create a corridor for them. They require a lot of space to travel within. They're not just as small as an insect that can only move from here to there. Bobcats move much further. So a lot of people's backyards in this area do fit into this section. Like we see on the graphic on the right, there's we're noted the different high priority areas. So these are the ones that we are looking to connect over time. I think by 2027 or so, I forget the exact number. But by connecting people's preserves, not only our preserves that we have, Nature Conservancy's preserves, and people's own properties, to connect them in order to have this more cohesive set of contiguous forests. So one of the major takeaways I'd like you to have in this presentation is to be an agent of change. An agent of change is something we use in a lot of our volunteer events, is to be able to encourage people to, even small steps make a lot of a difference. So whether it's just picking up some trash on the side of the road or in a stream, or planting a couple native plants in your yard. Every little bit counts as part of making it into the bigger picture. Because what we'd like to see here is the connectivity that we're aiming to have, like we've noted in these pictures. So creating these corridors through backyard habitats is a major factor into being a part of this bigger plan of the Bobcat Alley, and even just connecting New Jersey to a lot of different sections in general. Like we've talked about in for like the monarch butterfly, that is connecting habitats from Mexico to Canada on their migration. A lot of animals are moving through migration, and being able to keep up with those different changes, as well as having a place for them to have this safe refuge. Backyards tend to be sort of like a little rest stop for different animals and different insects, just like the monarchs used way stations with milkweed plants in different yards. Having a native composition in your backyard can just be like a little gas station for a lot of different insects and pollinators that need just to fuel up, to move on to their next area. So sometimes we just have to intervene a bit, with helping provide food and resources, since we were the ones, who took it from, our surroundings in the first place. So often we take from what we have around us. So it is nice to give back here and there. Also encourage education factor of this. Like Susie had opened up with, if your neighbor has barberry, then you're also going to have barberry. So just by attending this seminar, you're already taking the first step in understanding how you want to make your backyard better. But the real plan is to get everybody educated on this issue, is because all too often we have people don't know, that what the plant they're buying is not supposed to be here, and it's going to cause a lot of different, havoc through their woods. Often you can go to almost any nursery and find barberry, even though you can also go into any one of your woods and also find barberry, which is a disconnect that we have with a lot of different people and the lack of education that we have on the subject. So take what you learn from, this presentation and from other types of books, whether the ones that are recommended or through our different volunteer events or different seminars that we host. Use that information and, pass it along to others, whether it be your neighbors or your friends or your family. I encourage just to pass the information along. Also, if you have any kids in the family, whether they're your own or your neighbors or your grandkids, get them involved. They are truthfully the future. So getting them shaped and molded their brains into having, what your yard should look like, and what, how everything plays into it, where their water comes from and where their food comes from, things like that can really shape how they look into things in the future. Another small step you can take is by volunteering with us. So we host volunteer events on the first Saturdays of each month, and you can learn a lot, not only from us, but from the other volunteers and other volunteer events with other conservancies as well. You can learn different techniques that you're like, oh, I have this plant in my yard. Like, how are they getting rid of it? And how do I do that? Can I get other people to join me? And it's a good camaraderie to have in this type of setting that can be very Debbie Downer, just to be able to, do it with a group. So the quote that I have here is to never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world, for indeed it is only the thing that ever has. So even like I pressed upon earlier, is just, groups of people or even just small actions, they all make a difference, and they all fit into this conservation puzzle that we're all trying to figure out and trying to piece together over time. And, every little bit counts.